Only recently I have actually started to keep track of all my Nostalgia Trip games featured so far, so I would like to start this episode with apologies for not noticing that Hostages was already featured in the second Amiga episode of my Nostalgia Trip games, so it accidentally slipped in for the second time in the last Amiga episode. So to make up for that, today's Amiga episode will feature 11 games, and we're gonna start with a big one. Originally released for the NES in 1991, the Amiga conversion of Micro Machines from 1993 was the one I played first, usually with my friends. This was considered by some people as an upgraded Rally Speedway, which in some ways isn't far off, except for two major things. There are quite a few more types of vehicles you can race with, and Micro Machines is missing a track editor. I have featured Rally Speedway some years ago in one of my earlier Nostalgia Trip episodes, so if you care to check that out, a link straight to that one is provided in the video description. Reading about the first Micro Machines game on Wikipedia reveals that Rally Speedway was indeed a major influence on the game's development, particularly shown by the way the two-player mode has been handled. Instead of a split-screen solution, both players race on the same screen, and whichever player gets left so far behind as to drop out of the screen is given a penalty. However, instead of Rally Speedway-style time penalties, the players race to get penalty lamps lit for the other one, and whichever has less penalties wins the race. Different environments feature different track elements that would be completely out of place in anything with realism. Racing on pool tables makes you dive into pockets, which will transfer you out of other pool table pockets. Racing with radio-controlled tanks gives you the possibility to shoot their cannons at other players. Several environments feature jump ramps and odd bridges. Boats need to look out for whirlpools, etc. For solo players, Micro Machines offers a long campaign mode, which turns superbly difficult after maybe the first 15 races. Apparently there are 29 maps in the game, including a qualifying race and 3 bonus races that are played with vehicles that don't appear elsewhere in the game. I've never managed to complete Micro Machines, although I did play it quite extensively in the 90s and many times afterwards. Perhaps because of it, Micro Machines remains one of my absolute favorite racing games on the Amiga. Another old two-player favorite on the Amiga is an artillery duel type game that predates Team 17's Worms by a couple of years. Scorched Tanks was written by Michael Welch, who got inspired to write the game for the Amiga computers after playing Scorched Earth on a DOS PC a few times, and eventually got the game released as shareware in 1993. Scorched Tanks allows you to battle against 1 to 3 opponents, which can be either artificial or human. Before starting the game, you can adjust the computer opponent's IQ by sliding 2 dials adjusting their offensiveness and smartness. For the human players, the only adjustable thing is the amount of starting money. Like its DOS cousin, Scorched Tanks features a wide variety of weapons, the visual effects of which is largely responsible for the game's lasting entertainment value. Sure, playing with tanks will never be as agile as jumping worms, but there is a certain charm in trying to make the best with tanks that are practically immovable. I certainly enjoy this more than Worms. And I also enjoy Michael Welch's Windows remake of Scorched Tanks called Pocket Tanks, which I used to play almost religiously with my cousin for many years. More on that in a later episode. Since I already mentioned Team 17, I might as well mention one of their games as well. Alien Breed from 1991 was a game that I remember my first time playing it surprisingly clearly. I was at a friend's house one evening and his Amiga was loading the game. The simple but stunning loading screen appeared and I instantly knew I was going to like this game. Alien Breed is a top-down, multi-directionally scrolling shooter that attempts to take the Alien movie franchise and turn it into an epic shooting adventure, and succeeds with flying colors. The basic idea is to clear and take over an alien-infested space station. Since it is very much possible, it is also preferable to play the game with a friend. The way the game progresses is, you shoot aliens to clear the way, disable doors to close off areas, pick up money and keys and such items, access computers to buy better weapons and tools, and find an elevator to proceed to the next level. Eventually, you are required to use time bombs to destroy power cores and such. There are 6 enormous levels to blast through, ending with a battle against the Queen of the Xenomorphs. Personally, I've never gotten further than the 3rd level, but it is a superb game. And it was made even better with the 1992 Special Edition, which is actually the one I've played more. Alien Breed was blessed with a few sequels, which I've never bothered to try out until I got myself an A500 mini console, because Alien Breed 2 already requires AGA and lots of RAM to work, and that one is still top-down shooting. The latter sequels take a Doom-like first-person style, which doesn't really work too well. Anyway, the first Alien Breed, particularly the Special Edition, is definitely one of my all-time favorite Amiga nostalgia trip games, even though I'm not very good at it. Now, I don't often have the chance to include a Finnish game onto an Amiga-themed episode, but I finally remembered one Finnish game that I actually have the original disc of in my collection. The game is called Ratko, with a C or with a K depending on whether you're looking at the disc label or the loading screen.
WSOY presents Ratco.
This is basically just a version of Scrabble, with the only real special thing about it being that it's Finnish. Well, that and the title. I guess VSOY didn't have the rights to call it Scrabble, so they altered the board's visual in a barely mentionable manner and added a trash bin to drop useless letters into, a feature not available in the official Scrabble. I remember having played Ratko a few times in my early Amiga days, and revisited a few times after having bought myself an Amiga.
Slam.
Obviously, it's a rare item, if not necessarily a particularly sought-after rarity, but I'm pretty sure it's a game most of the old Finnish Amiga owners are well aware of. Next up, a platforming adventure game that everybody either loves to hate or hates to love. Rick Dangerous. Developed by Core Design and released by Firebird in 1989. At a time when Indiana Jones was still arguably the best thing on the silver screen with The Last Crusade, there seemed to be no good official Indiana Jones game around. Rick Dangerous filled that void for a while with a bunch of nice puzzle action, great locations, brilliant graphics, and funny sound effects. To top it all, the game starts with a famous rolling boulder scene from Raiders of the Lost Ark, reinvented to fit a side-viewed platformer. Most people I know who played Rick Dangerous more than casually would barely get to the halfway point of level 2, and only once I ever saw someone play all the way to the 3rd level. There are only 4 levels in Rick Dangerous, but the difficulty curve is steep as a skyscraper, and it's all trial and error. Most of the deaths are cheap and unpredictable and hardly ever possible to avoid on first attempt. However, once you get into the rhythm of it, the game flows splendidly and offers plenty of fun that gets you just enough hooked for you to return to it every now and then, as it is for me. The Amiga version is definitely my favorite, mostly because that's what I spent my time on when I was younger, but also because, all things considered, it is the best overall version of the game. That said, the 16-bit Rick Dangerous is considerably longer than the 8-bit Rick, so the amount of frustration is doubled. Anyway, I wrote a comparison of it some 9 years ago for the blog, so if you want to read about it, a link is provided in the video description as usual. Now here's a game that had a cheesy but somewhat controversial tagline made into a theme song. If you're an Amigist, you know what I'm talking about already, and of course it's Sensible Software's Cannon Fodder from 1993. Similarly to Sensible World of Soccer, which I have featured in the series earlier, the theme song features actual singing and sampled horns, this time in reggae style to give the message war has never been so much fun, a necessary tongue-in-cheek aspect. The visual style of Cannon Fodder is also similar to the Sensible Soccer series, of which the original game was released a year prior to this. It's the gameplay that separates the two entirely. You control your team of soldiers by clicking your mouse around the screen, with the possibility to separate team members and going solo or in multiple teams, and shoot enemy soldiers, demolish enemy structures with grenades, and try to rescue hostages whenever given the mission. One of the nicer gimmicks in the game that I remember my friends working on is to keep promoting your soldiers' ranks by surviving and completing missions. After each mission, numbers are being kept of the dead for home team and enemy team with suitably mournful music, while showing an increasingly long line of new soldiers getting ready to serve their country. Although Cannon Fodder is great fun to play and gives you a fair challenge, there's something about the game that always struck me as more anti-war than it seemingly gives you the impression. Whether that is to be taken as a criticism or not, I suppose depends on each person who is given the incentive to consider. For me, this makes Cannon Fodder more of a piece of art than it might have been intended as, and certainly one of the most important Amiga-originated games of all time. If I were not doing the blog and these videos, I can safely say I would play this game a lot more. Alright, now we have a completely different sort of a take on war, but still mostly humorous. This game though, North and South, is dubiously French-styled in its presentation, as it well should, since it's based on a Belgian comic book series, Les Tuniques Bleues. This fact, as well as the very clear stylistic approach, both escaped me until well into the 2000s, but now make complete sense to me because, rather unfortunately, while certainly compelling and charming, North and South is not particularly playable, at least on the Amiga where my nostalgia for the game mainly is. Les Tuniques Bleues, and consequently North and South, is, perhaps obviously, based on the American Civil War, which lasted from April 1861 to May 1865. You can select to play any of these years, which will affect the number of troops and owned areas upon starting the game. You can also select various hazards and computer's difficulty level if you don't play against a friend. You can play the game on mouse or joystick, but you do need the keyboard for some of the actions, such as selecting the attack groups in battle. As long as you're in the map screen or on battlefield, everything works well enough. It's the platforming sections for capturing a train or raiding a fort which make the Amiga version nearly unplayable thanks to the ridiculous speed and often uncooperative controls. The great graphics and funny music and sound effects are really what give the game its character, but it's not the most player-friendly Amiga game ever. To learn more about the different versions of North and South, I suggest you find the link to the FRGCB comparison in the video description and click on it to read. Lucasfilm games didn't become known to me until I played their point-and-click adventures on the Amiga sometime in the early 1990s. I'm not completely sure which one of them I played the first, but the first one I'm going to mention in this series is Maniac Mansion. This was originally written for the C64 and Apple II and published in 1987, and the 16-bit versions didn't get released until 1989. The premise of Maniac Mansion is, you play as Dave, whose girlfriend Sandy has been kidnapped by an evil scientist living in a ghoulish mansion, and with the aid from two of his selected friends, he is to rescue Sandy from the clutches of the evil Dr. Fred Edison. The game takes a large part of its inspiration from various horror movies, but everything in the game has a very humorous tinge to it. Still, it is possible to get caught by some of the more aggressive inhabitants of the Edison family house and taken into a holding cell. Unlike many adventure games before it, Maniac Mansion is very non-linear, as you can swap between the three characters quite at will and perform actions and explore the mansion and its near vicinity in your own chosen order. All of Dave's friends also have their own special abilities, which means you can complete the game in various ways. I also wrote a comparison of Maniac Mansion almost 8 years ago, so a link for that one is also provided in the video description. Point-and-click adventure gaming became pretty much obsolete at some point after the millennium, but it has somewhat re-emerged lately, which brings me hope for further games like these. Perhaps it is a good thing, though, that Maniac Mansion only has one sequel in Day of the Tentacle from 1993, because I've always felt the sequel took away a lot of the free-form charm of the original. Well, I suppose I'm a minority in that. Oh well. And now we have an Atari arcade game that I have played easily the most on Amiga, if only because that's what I had the first access to. The original arcade version of Rampart was released in 1990, but it was a very popular game on all sorts of home computers and consoles, so it's a game that has been on my to-do list for the comparison block for years now. It's a game that sort of combines old artillery games with Tetris, and it can be played in either a single-player mode against enemy ships, or in a two-player mode against your friends' cannons. You start by selecting a map to play on, then your optimal fortress location, and then you install a few cannons before the game truly starts. You have a short amount of time to fire as many cannonballs at your enemy's ships, castle walls, or even the cannons themselves as you can to get your enemy's conditions as dire as possible. When the time ends, you have another short amount of time to fix your walls and install as many new cannons as you have room, or as you have been given. The winner is the player that lasts the longest alive and gathers the most points. Win a few rounds and you will be taken to a more difficult environment with more difficult enemies. Rampart is not a game I ever excelled at, but it has always been one that I enjoy immensely whenever I get the inclination to launch it up and play it either by myself or against an available friend. It's also a game I enjoy just as much playing on MAME or DOS, but the Amiga version's sounds are what make this particular version so nostalgic for me. But I expect Rampart is good on other platforms as well, which is why I'm not particularly excited to write the comparison of it. Game number 10, and for today's episode, the second to last one, is a strategy game that has always intrigued me to some degree, but has never managed to keep my interest for more than an hour or two at any given time. Theme Park was the first in Bullfrog's line of lighter motif, smaller scale building and management simulations, which arrived sometime after considerable success from Maxis' Sim series and Bullfrog's own management games Powermonger, Syndicate, and Populous 1 and 2, and would later include Theme Hospital and Dungeon Keeper when they moved on to PCs. In Theme Park, your mission is to build an amusement park full of attractions, facilities, and workers, then advertise it as much as your budget allows, and hope to be able to enhance it for the next season. Of course, as in real-life theme parks, people will get injured or suffer from food poisoning and all sorts of things you will learn to expect sooner or later, so you'll need to really keep the devices maintained and your personnel up to some standard. Theme Park was originally designed for the PC, so the basic Amiga version is a bit of a downgrade of it, as is the Amiga 1200 AGA version, only less so. But Amiga was the platform I originally saw and played Theme Park on, and a lot of its charm for me remains drawn from there. Whatever platform you happen to choose to play Theme Park on, though, it is sure to provide a hefty amount of entrepreneurial entertainment. And finally, today's exception of an 11th game is a rarely mentioned platformer that even I have not revisited more than once since the 1990s. Harlequin from Gremlin 1992. And in addition to Commodore Amiga, it was only ever released on Atari ST. If I remember correctly, only one of my old Amiga friends from over 20 years ago had it, and I seem to remember also that we actually completed this game in one long session, or possibly two, since the game actually features a save and load system for which you need an additional formatted disk for the save files, as you usually would for Amiga and ST games. Since it has been such a long time probably playing Harlequin, I can't remember much from it, other than I liked the weird feel in the game, but had trouble keeping up with where to go and what to do most of the time. So because this was going to be a specifically special episode, I wanted to revisit this particular game for the occasion. I had a vague idea of the music being rather good in this game, and finding out that the legendary Barry Leach, who also made the music for Supercars 2, Lotus 2, and Silkworm, just to name a few, was responsible for this soundtrack as well, didn't really give me that much of a surprise that it was as good as it was. The graphics were just as good as I remembered them to be, although the amount and quality of the game's visuals makes Harlequin play a bit slowly compared to many of its contemporaries. However, with the amount of stuff going on in the game, I found it more of an advantage. From the meager effort I managed to record here, I realized that a key element in Harlequin is that it makes you travel back and forth different areas, where you need to pull switches to open new passages, sometimes in completely different areas. While the gameplay is basically just platforming and shooting hearts, you can also pick up some helpful items such as a bouncing ball to get you higher, circulating shield rockets that go around you, similar to the rocket shields in Supercars 2, an umbrella to make you fall more slowly and controlledly, and many others. As far as I'm able to tell, the plot seems to be about your journey to fix the clock tower in the starting area. It is a long game, even when you know what you're doing, so the save feature is definitely welcome here. But I do highly recommend it to any platforming enthusiast who hasn't come across this somewhat hidden gem yet.